The host smirks, looks Prince up and down, and mocks his feminine outfit live on national TV. You can feel the room tense, like everyone's waiting for Prince to get defensive or embarrassed. Instead, he pauses, then delivers a response so calm and precise, it completely flips the power dynamic. The joke stops being about Prince, the host becomes the punchline, and the audience realizes it in real time. Seconds later, 10,000 people are on their feet, cheering the moment Prince turns ridicule into dominance. The year was 1984. The venue was the American Music Awards, held at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles, broadcast live to millions of households across America. Prince was at the peak of Purple Rain's success, the album dominating charts, the movie breaking box office records, his face on every magazine cover. He'd arrived wearing what he always wore, clothes that defied categorization. Purple ruffled shirt, unbuttoned to reveal a lace bodysuit underneath, tight pants that looked painted on, heels that added 3 inches to his 5'2" frame, makeup perfectly applied, hair sculpted into processed curls. He looked like a Renaissance painting come to life, like something from another era or another planet, like anything except what 1984 America expected a successful male artist to look like. The host was Johnny Carson, the king of late-night television, the man who could make or break careers with a single joke, whose approval meant everything in the entertainment industry and whose mockery could end you. He was presenting the award for Favorite Soul R&B Album, and when Prince's name was announced as the winner, Carson couldn't help himself. As Prince walked toward the stage, Carson leaned into the microphone and said with that trademark smirk, "Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not entirely sure if we should be saying he or she tonight, but either way, here comes Prince." The audience laughed. Nervous, uncertain, the kind of laughter that comes from people who aren't sure if they're supposed to find something funny, but laugh anyway, because the person with power is laughing, and it's safer to join in than to object. Prince stopped walking, mid-stride, close enough that everyone could see his face, could watch him process what had just been said, could witness the moment when he had to decide, play along, defend himself, or do something no one expected. The laughter died out. The arena went quiet. 10,000 people holding their breath. Carson's smirk faltered just slightly. Just enough to reveal that maybe he'd miscalculated. Maybe he'd gone too far. Maybe the joke that would have worked on anyone else wasn't going to work on Prince. Prince turned, not toward the stage where Carson stood with the award, but toward the audience. All 10,000 of them. And he spoke not into the microphone that Carson was holding, but in a voice that somehow carried through the entire arena, that reached every corner, every balcony, every person who'd just laughed or not laughed, who'd felt uncomfortable or vindicated, who'd been waiting to see what would happen next. "Funny," Prince said, his voice quiet, but cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. "You're confused about my pronouns, about whether I'm a he or a she, about whether my clothes make me a man or something else, in your narrow understanding of gender." He started walking again, but not toward the stage. Toward where Carson stood, that smirk now completely gone, replaced by the dawning realization that he'd just lost control of his own show. "Let me help you with your confusion, Johnny," Prince continued, his voice getting stronger, more certain, like he was finally saying something he'd been holding in for years, for his entire career. For every time someone had questioned his masculinity, his sexuality, his right to exist exactly as he chose. "When you look at me and see my clothes, my ruffles, my lace, my heels, and your first instinct is to make a joke about my gender, that doesn't actually reveal anything about me. That reveals everything about you." The audience was completely silent now. Not the uncomfortable silence of witnessing something awkward, but the electric silence of people realizing they're witnessing something important, something that would be replayed and remembered and talked about for decades. "It reveals that you think there's only one way to be a man," Prince said, now standing directly in front of Carson, close enough that the host had to look down at him, had to confront the fact that this person he'd just tried to diminish was somehow impossibly, dominating the moment. That men have to dress a certain way, act a certain way, perform masculinity according to rules that were written by people like you, for people like you. Prince gestured at Carson's tuxedo, perfectly conventional, perfectly acceptable, perfectly boring. You're wearing a tux? Because that's what men wear to award shows. That's the uniform. The costume that tells everyone you're a serious person, a masculine person, a person who follows the rules and expects everyone else to follow them too. He touched his own ruffled shirt, his lace, his carefully constructed outfit that had taken hours to put together. That was as much art as any song he'd ever written. I'm wearing this. Because this is what I want to wear. Because I'm not interested in your rules about what makes someone a man. Because I understand something you don't. That clothes are just fabric. That gender is performance. That the only person who gets to define me is me. Carson tried to interrupt, tried to laugh it off, tried to regain the authority that had somehow slipped away from him. Now, Prince, I was just joking. No, Prince said firmly. You weren't joking. You were mocking. There's a difference. A joke is something everyone can laugh at together. Mockery is when you use someone's difference as a weapon against them. When you try to make them feel small, so you can feel big. Prince turned back to the audience, all 10,000 of them, and he did something no one expected. He smiled. Not a bitter smile, not a defensive smile, but a real smile. Genuine and warm and completely unafraid. You know what the really funny part is? Prince said, his voice now almost conversational, intimate despite the thousands listening. Johnny thinks he's insulting me by implying I look feminine. But femininity isn't an insult. Being compared to a woman isn't a degradation. The fact that he thinks it is, that he thinks calling me she, is the worst thing he could say. That tells you everything about how he views women, doesn't it? The audience erupted, not in laughter, but in applause, starting with a few people, then spreading like wildfire through the arena. Women, mostly. At first, women who'd spent their lives being told that being feminine was being less than, that being compared to them was an insult, that their existence was something men should avoid resembling at all costs. But then, men too. Young men, mostly. Men who'd felt the crushing weight of having to perform masculinity every day, who'd hidden parts of themselves because those parts didn't fit the narrow definition of acceptable maleness. I wear lace, Prince continued, his voice rising now, energized by the applause, by the validation, by the understanding that he wasn't just defending himself, but speaking for everyone who'd ever been mocked for not conforming. I wear ruffles. I wear heels. I wear makeup. And every time I do, someone like you tries to make it about my gender, about my sexuality, about whether I'm man enough by your standards. He took the award from Carson's hands, not roughly, but firmly, claiming what was his. But here's what you don't understand, Johnny. Here's what people like you will never understand. I don't care about your standards. I don't care if you think I'm masculine enough. I don't care if my clothes confuse you, or make you uncomfortable, or challenge your understanding of what a man should be. Prince held up the award. I'm standing here with this because millions of people connected with my music, not because I dress the way you think men should dress, not because I performed masculinity the way you think it should be performed, but because I was authentically, unapologetically myself. And people, all kinds of people, men and women, and everyone in between, they saw that authenticity, and they responded to it. The applause was deafening now. 10,000 people on their feet. Not just clapping, but cheering, screaming, expressing something that went beyond appreciation for a good comeback and into gratitude for someone finally saying what needed to be said about gender, about expression, about the prison that rigid definitions of masculinity create for everyone. You asked if you should say he or she, Prince said, looking directly at Carson again, who now looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, doing anything else, having never made that joke that seemed so clever 5 minutes ago. Here's your answer. You should say, Prince, because that's my name. That's who I am. Not a he, not a she, not your categories, or your boxes, or your desperate need to define me in terms you can understand. Just Prince. Just me. Just someone who refuses to let your confusion about gender become my problem to solve. He started to walk off stage, then paused, turned back one more time. And Johnny? That confusion you felt when you looked at me? That discomfort? That's not because there's something wrong with how I dress. That's because there's something limited about how you think, about how you view gender and expression and what it means to be human. And I genuinely hope that someday you'll understand that you'll see that the world is bigger and more complex and more beautiful than your narrow definitions allow for. Prince walked off stage. The applause followed him, grew louder as he disappeared into the wings. The camera stayed on Carson, whose face had gone through a journey in those few minutes, from smug confidence to confusion to something that almost looked like shame. The show tried to continue, went to commercial, came back with the next presenter, but no one was paying attention anymore. Everyone was talking about what had just happened, about Prince refusing to accept mockery as the price of success, about someone on live television naming exactly what was wrong with casual gender-based cruelty disguised as humor. Backstage, Prince was surrounded by other artists. Madonna hugged him, tears in her eyes. David Bowie shook his hand, said, "That was bloody brilliant." Boy George thanked him for saying what they'd all felt, but never had the platform or the courage to articulate so perfectly. And dozens of other artists who'd faced similar mockery, who'd been made to feel that their self-expression was a problem, who'd been told explicitly or implicitly that they needed to be more conventional, more acceptable, more willing to play by rules designed to keep them small. But the real impact happened outside that arena. In living rooms across America, where young people, boys wearing their sisters' makeup in secret, girls dressing in ways that felt right but that everyone told them was wrong, kids who didn't fit into either category and didn't understand why they had to, they watched Prince refuse to be ashamed, watched him turn mockery into power, watched him claim his identity so absolutely that the person trying to diminish him ended up diminished instead. Phone lines at LGBTQ+ organizations lit up that night. Calls from teenagers saying they'd been on the edge, been ready to give up, been convinced that being different meant being wrong. But they'd watched Prince, watched him stand in front of 10,000 people wearing lace and heels and makeup, watched him refuse to be anything other than exactly who he was. And something shifted. If Prince could do it, if Prince could be that visible, that successful, that unapologetically himself, then maybe they could too. Fashion magazines that had dismissed Prince's style as costume or persona suddenly had to reckon with it as statement, as art, as legitimate self-expression. Designers started citing him as influence. Not just in men's fashion, though that certainly shifted, became more adventurous, more willing to incorporate traditionally feminine elements, but in the broader conversation about gender and clothing, and who gets to wear what. Johnny Carson never apologized publicly, never acknowledged that he'd been wrong. But people who worked on his show said he was different after that night, more careful, more conscious of how his jokes could wound, more aware that humor at someone's expense wasn't actually humor at all, just cruelty with a punchline. And Prince? Prince kept wearing lace, kept wearing ruffles and heels and makeup, and everything that people like Carson thought made him less than. Kept proving that the definition of masculinity they were protecting was too narrow, too limiting, too invested in conformity, and threatened by difference. The awards kept coming. The sales kept climbing. The influence kept expanding. And every time someone tried to mock his appearance, to question his gender presentation, to make him the punchline of jokes about being too feminine, people remembered that night at the American Music Awards, remembered that Prince had already answered those questions, had already explained that the mockery revealed the mocker's limitations, not his own. Years later, when Prince died, the tributes poured in. And so many of them mentioned not just his music but his fashion, his fearlessness, his refusal to be contained by gender norms that felt natural to people like Carson, but suffocating to everyone else. One tribute came from a trans woman named Sarah, who wrote, "I was 15 inches 1,984, closeted, terrified, convinced I could never be who I really was. Then I watched Prince on the AMAs. Watched him refuse to be ashamed of wearing women's clothes. Watched him turn mockery into power. And I understood that authenticity wasn't just possible, it was the only way to truly live." 20 years later, when I transitioned, when I faced my own mockery and judgment, I thought about Prince, about how he stood there in lace and heels and said, "This is who I am. Deal with it." And that gave me the courage to say the same. That's the legacy of that moment. Not a celebrity owning a host, or a viral clapback, or whatever reductive language the internet would later use, but a lesson in power. In understanding that when someone mocks your self-expression, they're revealing their own fear of difference, their own investment in conformity, their own inability to imagine a world where people can be who they are without apologizing for it. Prince stood on that stage wearing ruffles and lace and heels, got mocked for it by someone who thought that mockery was safe, was acceptable, was just humor. And in 3 minutes of perfect clarity, Prince showed everyone watching that masculinity isn't about clothes or presentation or conforming to someone else's standards. Masculinity, real strength, real power, real courage, is about being so absolutely certain of who you are that no one else's opinion can touch it. Johnny Carson thought he was making a joke about gender. Prince showed him he was actually making a statement about fear. Fear of difference, fear of change, fear of a world where people don't have to perform gender the way it's always been performed. And when 10,000 people stood up and cheered, they weren't just applauding a good comeback. They were applauding freedom. The freedom to be yourself without apology. The freedom to express gender, however, feels authentic to you. The freedom to wear lace and ruffles and heels and know that the only person who has to approve of how you look is you. That's revolution. That's what happens when someone refuses to let ridicule work, when they name exactly what's happening, expose the cruelty underneath the humor, and turn the tables so completely that the mocker becomes the mocked. The feminine outfit, the uncertain pronouns, the smirking host, and the response that turned it all around. That's not just a moment of TV history. That's a blueprint for everyone who's ever been told they're too much, too different, too feminine, too masculine, too anything that doesn't fit into the narrow boxes society provides. Prince wore what he wanted, got mocked for it, and responded with such certainty, such power, such absolute refusal to be diminished, that he didn't just win the exchange, he changed the conversation entirely. Made it impossible for anyone watching to ever again pretend that mocking someone's gender expression was harmless fun. The host thought he had the power, the microphone, the platform, the approval of mainstream America. But Prince had something more powerful, the absolute certainty of someone who knows exactly who they are. And when those two forces collided, mockery versus authenticity, authenticity won so decisively that 10,000 people couldn't help but cheer. Because they'd just watched someone refuse to be small, refuse to be shamed, refuse to accept that clothes determined worth, or that gender was something someone else got to define. They'd watched revolution happen in real time, and they cheered because they understood they were witnessing not just a moment, but a movement. Not just a comeback, but a manifesto. Prince in lace and ruffles and heels. Absolutely, completely, devastatingly more powerful than any man in any tuxedo who thought conformity equaled strength. That's the real story. That's what those 10,000 people were cheering for. That's what millions more who watched at home understood in that moment. Freedom looks like whatever you want it to look like. And anyone who mocks you for it is just advertising their own prison.